Hi everyone. So this is our first video lesson that we're going to be doing. So I'm going to be posting most of your notes through these videos that I'm going to be posting on YouTube, but making sure I put these on Teams so you can see them and you'll get notification that they're there. So I just want to let you know with these videos, feel free to pause at any moment so you have more time as you're taking notes. It's a really good idea to take down these notes. We will be using them in class, so it's definitely something you want to do. Um, so we're going to get started. So this is our introduction to anatomy and physiology, where we're going to be talking about right now a lot of different anatomical terms that we'll be using throughout the class. Okay. So first of all, anatomy is the Greek word for cutting up. So this is the physical structure of the body. So thinking very cut and dry placement, things like that. So it's the locations for the structures of organs, tissues, etc. Where the physiology is about talking about the functions of these things. So the relationship to nature. So how these things work in our bodies. So study of body structure functions. So first we're going to talk about different levels of organization. So we know that from the smallest part that we learned in a chemistry class are those subatomic particles, atoms. We're moving into molecules and macromolecule, organelles, which you talked about in your biology class, cells, and here is where we're going to start with our tissues. So we're moving from tissue to the larger organism. So we're going from tissues to organs to organ systems to looking at the organism as a whole. So some characteristics of life that is really important that every organism has. So movement is a really big one. So that change of position, responsiveness, growth, reproduction, and respiration. Some more: digestion, absorption, circulation, assimilation, and excretion. So all of these are different characteristics of life that, especially for humans, we need to have all of these. Say, if you pass out, people are going to check for these different characteristics of life to see if you are still alive and breathing. These are the things that people look for in those processes. So responsiveness is the reaction change taking place inside or outside of our body. Growth is the increase of body shape, so we grow from when we are a child. Reproduction, the ability to create new organisms, new cells. Respiration, the obtaining oxygen and removing the carbon dioxide and releasing energy from those foods. Digestion is the breakdown of those food substance. Absorption is being able to take those nutrients that we get from our food, our fluids, to our body. Circulation is the movement of substances from place to place in our bodily fluids. Assimilation is changing absorbed substances into chemically different forms, which is really important with the idea of our digestive system in place. And then excretion is the removal of those waste products. Okay. So collectively, these physical and chemical reactions constitute to our metabolism. And these vital signs are observable body functions that reflect those metabolic activities for essentials of life. So if you pass out and someone is coming to look after you, they're going to look for some vital signs. And those vital signs are going to include, are you breathing? So that respiration. Is there movement in your abdomen showing your lungs are inhaling and exhaling? Those are the types of things that they're going to look for with vital signs. So just like I said, measuring body temperature, blood pressure, pulse, heart rate, and respiratory rate. And these are all important for the maintenance of life. So some requirements for that are going to be water. You need water to perform these metabolic processes and to help with that transport of substances. Food to supply energy to your body and all of the tissues in your body. Oxygen, so it releases energy from our food. I'm sure you learned that, and we'll be talking about it as well. Heat, so that regulates our metabolic reactions. Pressure, so atmospheric pressure is really important in the respiratory system, and we will be talking about that. So for breathing and for blood circulation. And probably the thing that we'll talk about a lot is homeostasis. So that is the balance to maintain a stable internal environment. So we are warm-blooded is a term that you hear a lot. So we're able to regulate our own body temperature. And this is a big part of homeostasis because that is how we maintain that stable internal environment. So these three components of homeostasis are receptors, so that provides the information. The control center, so that's the set point. It's usually your brain or some sort of nerve in your body. And then effectors, so that's what allows the responses to occur in our body. Talking about an example, so something happens, a stimulus happens. So this is where we start with our stimulus. Say it's really cold outside, so our outside body temperature starts to decrease. Our receptors are going to listen to that information and bring it to our control center, where our control center is going to say, okay, it's really cold outside. We need to dilate blood vessels or do whatever. So our effectors are going to perform those tasks, and in response, the change is corrected. So there happens in two different, what we call feedback loops. So the first one we're going to talk about is negative feedback. So negative feedback is when something is performed to come back to a normal level. So body temperature is a really good explanation that I just used before. So if you get too cold, a triggered reaction in a negative feedback loop is to bring it back up to the original body temperature. Positive feedback is kind of the opposite. Instead, it enforces the nature of what is occurring. So milk production is a good example of this, because the more that this happens, the more milk is produced. So instead of bringing it back to a normal, it increases the process. Another example of this is when a female is in labor, the contractions enhance, which is a positive feedback loop. So again, just another example here is body temperature. So the stimulus here is that body temperature is moving higher than normal. Thermoreceptors send that signal to our control center, which is our hypothalamus in our brain. The effectors is that the blood vessels dilate and sweat glands secrete sweat, and then we lose some temperature, which brings us back to a normal body temperature. And the opposite reaction, when our body temperature is too low, same thing, our thermoreceptors send that signal to our hypothalamus. And there's two different things that will happen if we're too low. So one of the effectors is that our blood vessels will constrict and sweat glands will be inactive. And if the body temperature continues to drop, we'll begin to shiver. So that's the contraction of muscles, which generates heat in the body to help raise that body temperature. So we're going to talk a little bit about the organization and the different places that you'll find organs in your body. So the first is our cranial cavity, right here. We have our vertebral canal. So that's what houses our spinal column that you can see. A thoracic cavity, And then our abdominopelvic cavity, which is actually made up of two different cavities itself, is our abdominal and our pelvic. And our diaphragm here is what separates our thoracic and our abdominopelvic cavity. So just from a frontal view, really looking at this abdominal cavity, we have a right pleural cavity, which is this lung space right here. We also have a left pleural cavity. Our pericardial cavity is what houses our heart. Our mediastinum starts from the top of our breastbone all the way down to the bottom of our diaphragm. And all of those things make up that thoracic cavity. And then you can see from a different view the other cavities that I mentioned before. So some smaller cavities that you're going to see, we have orbital cavities, we have different sinus cavities, so we have frontal sinuses, where cranial cavity is still here, a nasal cavity here, and an oral cavity. So those are some smaller cavities within our face. So talking about some different membranes that I mentioned a little bit. So our serous membranes line body cavities which do not open to the outside of our body. So there's two layers. We have a visceral layer and a peritoneal layer. And there's three main serous membranes, so we're going to talk about those. So a pleural membrane. So there's a visceral pleural membrane, which covers the lungs. So when you hear pleural, you want to think of lungs. And then there's a peritoneal pleural cavity, which lines that pleural cavity as a whole. So visceral is right on the organ, where peritoneal lines the whole cavity that it's in. We have pericardial membranes. So pericardial, you're going to want to think of the heart. So the visceral pericardium covers the heart directly on the organ, and then the peritoneal pericardium lines that whole cavity. And then our last one, peritoneal cavity. So our visceral peritoneum covers the organs of the abdominal cavity. So that's going to include your stomach, intestines, liver, all of those organs directly on the organ. And then we have our peritoneum, which covers the entire abdominal cavity itself. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop for these notes. There will also be an Edpuzzle video, which I will show you how to get to when we are in class. So you'll get directions on how to enter Edpuzzle. With those videos, there are going to be some questions throughout the video that you have to answer, and I will receive those answers and you will get credit for those. Okay, I'll see you in class.